You want to know what I saw at Verdun? That's fine, but I need you to understand something before I say another word. I have told this story exactly twice in my entire life. Once to a priest, and once to my brother, who stopped speaking to me for 3 months afterward. Not because he thought I was lying, but because he knew I wasn't, and that frightened him more than any lie could have. It was October 1916, and the mud in the communication trenches was so deep that men had drowned in it, not from shell fire, not from gas, but simply because they stepped wrong in the dark and went under before anyone could reach them. That was the kind of place Verdun was. The ground itself was trying to kill you, and it was doing a remarkable job of it. But the ground was not the only thing. Let me tell you what Verdun actually was, because most people hear that name and they think of war in the general sense. Trenches, mud, suffering. And while all of that is true, that description is like calling the ocean wet. It is technically accurate and completely useless for helping you understand what it actually felt like to be standing inside it. The Battle of Verdun began in February 1916 and did not end until December of that same year. Liga, which is 302 consecutive days of uninterrupted industrial slaughter. The German High Command designed the offensive with a specific and openly stated purpose: not to take ground, not to capture a strategically important position, but to bleed the French army to death by degrees. Their word for it was Ausblutung, which translates roughly to bleeding white. The plan was to feed French soldiers into that battlefield at a rate France could not sustain, not to win territory, but to drain an entire nation of its fighting men until there were none left to send. That was the whole of it. Death deliberately engineered and carefully maintained for as long as it took to finish the job. By the time the guns finally went quiet, somewhere between 650,000 and 700,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing across an 18-mile stretch of northeastern France. Not across a country, not across a continent, but 18 miles of ground that you could drive across in 20 minutes on a clear day. And that ground never recovered from what was done to it. Even now, more than 100 years after the last shell fell, the soil around Verdun still releases unexploded ordnance after heavy rain, still contaminates the water table, and still occasionally returns a boot with a foot still inside it. The French government has permanently closed the worst affected areas under a designation called the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone. Land so completely saturated with the chemistry of death that it has been declared unfit for human habitation, not temporarily, but forever. Now here is the detail I need you to hold on to before I tell you what Henri witnessed in that place. During the worst weeks of the fighting, the artillery bombardments were so relentless that the soil across the battlefield was being turned over completely every 72 hours. Men buried by one shell were being unearthed by the next, and buried again, and unearthed again after that, in a cycle that had no end and no mercy. The dead at Verdun were given no rest whatsoever. And so here is the question I have never been able to answer in all the years since Henri told me his story. In a place where the earth itself refuses to keep the dead buried, what else might that same earth have eventually disturbed? My name is not important. What is important is that I was 23 years old when I arrived at Verdun in September of 1916. And I was the kind of young man who still believed, genuinely believed, that there was an order to things. That the world made sense if you looked at it carefully enough. That every strange thing had a rational explanation waiting behind it, like a door you simply hadn't opened yet. I had been assigned as a courier attached to the 131st Infantry Regiment, which sounds more dignified than it was. What it meant in practice was that I spent my days moving messages between command posts through communication trenches that smelled of rot and unwashed men, and something else underneath all of that. Something older and harder to name, I had grown up on a farm outside Bordeaux, so I was not a delicate person. I had butchered animals. I had worked in summer heat that would flatten a city man in an hour, and when I thought that background had prepared me for discomfort, it had not prepared me for this. The first man I spoke to when I reached the forward trench was a corporal named Gaston Merle, a thick-shouldered man from Lyon who had been at Verdun since April. He looked at my clean uniform the way a very old dog looks at a puppy, with a kind of exhausted patience that had nothing kind in it. "How long have you been here?" I asked him, trying to sound like someone who belonged. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. "Long enough to know that you don't lean over the parapet after dark," he said. "Not for any reason. Not to look, not to listen, not even to be sick over the side. You keep your head down and you keep your eyes forward, and you do not, under any circumstances, try to see what is moving out there." I laughed. I actually laughed. He did not. I would spend the next several weeks learning exactly why that warning was not something he had said lightly. And the education would come not through my own experience alone, but through the accounts of 3 men who had already paid the price for not knowing what Gaston knew. 3 men who had looked out into that dark ground and seen something that the war, for all its industrialized horror, had not put there. The first account I am going to tell you did not happen to me directly. It happened to a man named Etienne Beaumont, an infantryman from Reims who had been in the forward trench for 6 consecutive weeks before I arrived. I know this because Gaston told me about him on my second night, quietly, while we were sharing a tin of cold coffee that tasted like charcoal and river water. "You need to hear what Etienne saw," Gaston said, not looking at me, but staring at the opposite wall of the trench like a man reciting something he had memorized against his will. "Not because I want to frighten you, because you need to know what the rules are before you break one by accident." Etienne had been on night watch in late July, which was the worst period of the entire battle. The period when the shelling was so constant that men were losing their hearing permanently, and nobody was bothering to document it anymore, because there were simply too many cases to count. It was the kind of night where the horizon to the north glowed a dull orange from distant artillery fire, and the smell coming across no man's land was something that a man's mind tried very hard to refuse to identify, because identifying it meant accepting what it was. Etienne was watching the wire. That was his job, to watch the 50 or 60 meters of broken ground between the French line and the German line, to look for movement, to listen for the particular sound of a German raiding party moving through the dark. He had done it dozens of times. He knew what to look for, and he knew how to keep his nerves steady while he looked. What he saw that night was not a German raiding party. There were wounded men in no man's land, as there almost always were. Men who had gone down during the day's assault and could not be retrieved. Men who had been calling out since sunset in voices that had grown progressively weaker as the hours passed. The standing order was not to go out after them until there was enough cloud cover to make a retrieval attempt reasonably survivable. And that night, the sky was almost completely clear, which meant those men were going to spend the night where they were. Etienne said he had made his peace with that, or as much peace as a man can make with a thing like that. And then, somewhere around 2 in the morning, he noticed something moving among them. His first thought was that it was another soldier, someone from his own unit who had gone over the top without authorization to bring a wounded man in, which happened occasionally despite the orders against it. But the movement was wrong. That was the word he used when he told Gaston about it afterward. Wrong. It was not moving the way a man moves when he is crawling carefully through open ground, trying to avoid being shot. It was moving the way something moves when it is not afraid of being seen. Low and continuous and unhurried, passing from one fallen man to the next with a kind of patient, methodical intention that made Etienne's stomach turn before his mind had even caught up with why. "What did it look like?" I asked Gaston. And I noticed my voice had dropped to almost nothing without me deciding to lower it. Gaston turned his tin of coffee slowly in his hands before he answered. He said it was dark. Not dark like a man wearing dark clothing. Dark like a shape that the darkness itself had decided to make solid. And it was wrong in its proportions. The arms were too long, or the way it held them was too long. He could not decide which. Again, it moved between the wounded men the way you move between furniture in a room you know well at night, without hesitating, without searching, like it already knew exactly where each one of them was. Etienne watched it for what he estimated was 4 or 5 minutes before he fully understood what he was seeing. It was not helping the wounded men. It was not checking them, not trying to drag them to safety, not doing anything a man or an animal would do. It was crouched over each one in turn, and when the men it visited stopped making sounds, not all at once, one by one, in the order it reached them. And after each one went quiet, it would pause for a moment in a way that Etienne described as settling, like something taking its time, and then it would move on to the next. When it reached the man closest to the French wire, a soldier named Poirier, who had been calling out for water since early evening, Etienne finally got a clear look at its shape against the faint orange glow of the northern horizon. He said it was larger than a man, but not enormously so, not in a way that would have seemed impossible in daylight. What was impossible was the angle of its head as it bent over Poirier. It tilted at a degree that a human neck does not allow, slowly and completely, like something that had a great deal of interest in what it was doing and no awareness whatsoever of being observed. Poirier stopped calling out. Etienne did not fire his rifle. He did not call out to the men beside him. He pressed himself against the back wall of the trench, and he did not move again until the light began to change in the east, and the shape in no man's land was simply gone, the way a thought is gone when you try to hold it too tightly. In the morning, when the retrieval party went out, Poirier was not where he had fallen. There was no body, no equipment, and no sign that he had ever been there at all, except for a shallow depression in the mud, roughly the size and shape of a man. Gaston finished his coffee and looked at me steadily. "Now, you know why we don't lean over the parapet after dark," he said. I did not laugh this time. The men had a name for them by the time I arrived, though nobody could tell me exactly who had coined it first or when it had entered the vocabulary of the trench. They called them les mangeurs d'ombre, which translates from French as the shadow feeders, and the name had spread through the forward positions the way all trench knowledge spread, not through official channels, not through any order or briefing, but through the quiet, careful conversations that men have when they are trying to warn each other about something without saying it loudly enough to make it completely real. As for why nobody reported it up the chain of command, Gaston explained that with a simplicity that I found difficult to argue with. "You report something like this to a lieutenant," he said, "and one of two things happens. Either he decides you have lost your mind from the shelling and sends you to the medical officer, which takes you off the line but not in any way you would want. Or he decides you are a coward who is inventing supernatural stories to avoid going over the top. And that particular conclusion has only one outcome." He did not need to finish the sentence. We both understood what that outcome was. The second account is the one that Henri told me himself, in that hospital room in Lyon 40 years after the war ended, with every light in the room burning and the window closed despite the heat of the summer night outside. It is the account I have spent the most time thinking about, the one that comes back to me in the particular way that true things come back, not as a story you remember, but as an image that is simply there when you close your eyes, whether you invited it or not. It was November 1916, late in the battle, during a period of relative quiet that the men in the trench treated with more suspicion than they treated the shelling, because by that point, They had learned that quiet at Verdun was not the absence of danger, but simply danger in a form that had not yet announced itself. Henri was a stretcher bearer, which in theory meant he worked under the protection of the Geneva Convention, and in practice meant he worked in conditions that the Geneva Convention had not been designed to imagine. He was 26 years old. He was from a small village in Brittany, and he told me that before Verdun, he had been the kind of man who could sleep anywhere, in any conditions, through any noise. He had not slept properly in 4 months by the time this happened. A soldier named Marceau had gone down in no man's land that afternoon during a brief and unsuccessful assault on a German position 40 meters from the French wire. Marceau was not dead, or had not been dead when he fell, because he had been audible throughout the evening, calling out at irregular intervals in a voice that carried clearly in the cold November air. Henri had served alongside Marceau for 7 months. They had eaten together, argued together, written letters home, sitting side by side in the same patch of trench. When the cloud cover thickened around midnight and his sergeant told him it was his call whether to go out, Henri did not hesitate. I should have hesitated, he told me. And the way he said it, flat and without any drama, was somehow worse than if he had said it with emotion. He went over the top alone, which was against protocol, but the only other stretcher bearer on shift had a badly infected hand, and Henri did not want to wait for a replacement. He moved low and fast through the first 20 meters, using the shell craters for cover the way he had been trained, stopping every few meters to listen for movement from the German line. The ground was soft from recent rain, and his hands sank into it with each forward movement in a way he described as the ground accepting him, which was a detail that stayed with me for reasons I cannot entirely explain. He found Marceau's helmet first, half submerged in the mud, and then he found Marceau, or what the situation with Marceau had become. And he told me that he stopped moving completely for a moment that felt very long, trying to process what he was seeing. Something was already there. It was crouched over Marceau, with its back to Henri, and Henri's first sensation was not visual, but olfactory. Meaning the smell reached him before anything else did. He struggled to describe it to me adequately, cycling through several comparisons before settling on the one that seemed to satisfy him most. He said it smelled like the inside of a butcher's shop in high summer, when the meat has been sitting without ice for a day longer than it should have. That particular sweetness that is not really sweetness at all, but the smell of organic matter in the process of surrendering to something. Mixed into that was something mineral and cold, like wet stone in a very old building, like the inside of a well that has not been used in a long time. Henri said he became aware of the sound it was making before he became aware that it was making a sound, which is a distinction he was particular about and which I think is worth preserving exactly as he stated it. It was a low sound, continuous and rhythmic, somewhere between a vibration and a frequency. And he said the closest comparison he could find for it was the sound of a large cat purring, but slowed down considerably and stripped of anything that could be described as contentment. It was the same action, the same basic mechanical quality, but with everything warm removed from it. Then it turned its head, not its whole body, just its head rotating slowly on its neck to look back at him over what he said was an impossible angle, the way Etienne had described, that tilt that a human neck refuses to perform. And Henri saw its face, or what occupied the position where a face should have been. He was quiet for a long time before he described this part to me. Long enough that I thought perhaps he had decided not to continue. Then he said that it did not have a face in the way that you and I understand a face. What it had was a suggestion of features. The way a face pressed against thin fabric from the other side creates an impression of a face without actually showing you one. Dark, not completely solid looking, with 2 points of dull luminescence where the eyes would have been, not bright, not glowing in any dramatic sense, but present in the way that 2 candles are present in a very large dark room, just enough light to locate them, not enough to see by. They looked at each other for a period of time that Henri estimated at several seconds, but admitted could have been longer, because his sense of time had stopped functioning in any reliable way. It did not move toward him. It did not make any gesture or sound beyond that continuous low frequency that Henri said he could feel specifically in his back teeth and in the base of his throat. It simply looked at him with those two dull points of light. When Henri understood in the wordless way that the body understands things before the mind catches up, that Marceau was already gone, had been gone for some time, and that whatever was crouched over him had finished what it came to do and was in no particular hurry about anything. Henri began moving backward through the mud, slowly, keeping his eyes on it the entire time. It watched him go without moving, without changing its position, and with a patience and an indifference that he said was the most frightening quality of the entire encounter. More frightening than its appearance, more frightening than the smell or the sound. Indifference, he explained to me, is what you feel towards something that does not concern you, towards something that is not a threat because it is not something you need to consider at all. And that was precisely how it looked at me as I retreated. Not as a predator watching prey escape, as something watching a thing of no particular consequence move away from it. He made it back to the trench. He did not speak for the remainder of the night. And when morning came and someone asked him where Marceau was, he said simply that Marceau was not coming back and that they should not send anyone to look for him. Nobody asked him why. Nobody went out after dark to look for the missing after that. Not officially, not unofficially, not for any reason that could be named in the daylight hours. And the sergeants and the lieutenants and even the captains who should have demanded answers seemed, without a single word being exchanged, to have quietly decided that some questions were better left unasked. The third account is the hardest one to tell, and I want you to understand that I am not saying that for effect. I am saying it because the first two accounts, as disturbing as they were, both ended with the witness intact and at a distance from the thing they had seen. Etienne watched from the parapet. Henri retreated through the mud and made it back. Both of them were able to put some measure of space between themselves and what happened. And that space, however small, is the difference between a man who is frightened and a man who is broken. The man who witnessed the third account did not have that space. He was standing close enough to reach out and touch what happened, and he could do nothing. And he knew while it was happening that he could do nothing, and he had to stand there and be completely present for every second of it. His name was Corporal Felix Aubert, and I met him only once, briefly, in the winter of 1917, by which point he was a man who had the particular quality of stillness that you sometimes see in people who have used up something that does not grow back. It happened in late October 1916, on a night that Felix described as almost peaceful by Verdun standards, meaning the shelling had reduced to an intermittent rumble in the middle distance, and the immediate sector had been quiet for several hours. Felix was on watch with a young soldier named Thomas Vallet, who was 18 years old and had been at the front for less than 3 weeks. Thomas was the kind of young soldier who asked questions constantly, not out of anxiety, but out of genuine curiosity. The kind of person who wanted to understand the mechanics of everything around him. And Felix told me that he had found this quality both endearing and exhausting in roughly equal measure. They had been on watch for about 2 hours when Thomas touched Felix on the arm and pointed out toward the wire. "There is someone out there," Thomas whispered. "Look, between the second and third posts. Someone is moving." Felix looked. There was indeed movement, slow and irregular, consistent with a man crawling through the mud, and Felix's immediate assessment was that it was one of their own men returning from some unsanctioned errand, the kind of thing that happened with enough regularity that it had its own informal protocol, which was to say nothing and see nothing until the man was safely back over the parapet. "It is probably Sergeant Dumas," Felix whispered back. "He goes out sometimes. Do not make a sound and do not shine a light." Thomas nodded, and they both watched the shape moving through the dark toward the French line. It moved slowly, dragging itself forward with the particular exhausted rhythm of a man who has been in the mud for a long time and has very little left to give. When it reached the base of the parapet, Felix leaned down and extended his hand to help it over. And the hand that took his was cold in a way that soil temperature alone could not account for. Cold in the way that something is cold when warmth has been leaving it for an extended period of time. It was not Sergeant Dumas. It was a French soldier that neither Felix nor Thomas recognized. A man of perhaps 30 years with a face so caked in mud that his features were barely distinguishable, while wearing a uniform that Felix noted with a confusion he could not immediately explain, seemed too deteriorated to belong to a man who was still alive and moving. The soldier did not speak. He looked at Felix with an expression that Felix struggled to categorize for me, settling eventually on the description of a man who is trying very hard to communicate something urgent, but has lost access to the words. "Who are you?" Felix asked quietly. "What unit are you from?" The soldier opened his mouth. Nothing came out except a sound that Felix said was barely a sound at all, more of an exhalation with shape to it. And then the man turned his head and looked back out toward no man's land with an expression that Felix said was the most purely terrified thing he had ever seen on a human face, before or since. That was when Felix saw what was at the edge of the wire. It was not one of them. It was three, positioned at irregular intervals along the French wire with the same patient, unhurried quality that Henry had described, that absolute absence of urgency that was somehow more alarming than aggression would have been. They were not attempting to cross the wire. They were simply standing at it, if standing is the right word for what they were doing, which Felix said it was not quite. Because standing implies a relationship with the ground that these things did not appear to have. They were present at the wire in the way that a shadow is present on a wall, and as if the darkness had locally thickened into shapes that had not quite committed to being fully solid. Thomas made a sound beside him, a small, involuntary sound, and Felix grabbed his arm hard. "Do not move," Felix said, and his voice came out in a register he did not recognize as his own. "Do not move, and do not make another sound." The unknown soldier beside them was shaking. Felix could feel it through the man's uniform where their arms were pressed together. A deep, continuous tremor that was not from cold. Felix kept his eyes on the shapes at the wire and reached slowly for the unknown soldier's arm to pull him further back into the trench, and his hand closed on empty air. The man was gone. Not gone the way a man steps away. Gone the way a candle goes out, between one moment and the next, with no intermediate state and no explanation. Felix turned to look, and there was nothing beside him. And when he looked back at the wire, the three shapes were also gone. And the only evidence that any of it had happened was Thomas standing pressed against the trench wall with both hands over his mouth and his eyes wide open and completely fixed on the space where the unknown soldier had been standing. They did not speak for the rest of the watch. When the relief came at dawn and Felix was finally able to move, he walked the length of the trench until he found Gaston, lost, and he told him what had happened in a low and level voice that he said felt like it belonged to someone else. Gaston listened without interrupting. When Felix finished, Gaston was quiet for a moment, and then he asked the question that Felix said he had already been asking himself since the moment it happened. "Did you recognize the uniform? Which regiment?" Felix had been thinking about this since the moment the man came over the parapet. The uniform had been French, and the cut and the insignia unmistakably French. But the deterioration of it had been wrong for a man who was still living, still moving, still capable of reaching out and taking a hand in the dark. I think, Felix said slowly, that he had been out there for a very long time. At dawn, when the light was strong enough to see by, Felix looked out over the parapet at the ground in front of the wire. The mud was undisturbed. There were no marks, no tracks, no sign that anything had crossed it in either direction during the night. There was nothing out there at all. I think about Henry sometimes, in that hospital room in Lyon, with every light burning and the window closed against the summer night. I think about the way he made me promise to wait until he was gone before I repeated any of it. And I think about the fact that even 40 years later, even at the very end of his life, he still could not sleep in the dark. It was October 1916, and the mud in the communication trenches was so deep that men had drowned in it, not from shellfire, not from gas, but simply because they stepped wrong and went under before anyone could reach them. And something else was out there in that dark, moving among them with patience and purpose and absolute indifference. I have never been able to answer the question that keeps me awake at night. Were any of them ever truly alone out there? If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe because there are more stories like this one. Stories that have been waiting a very long time to be told.